I okay, it's just about the time we wanted to be back. So again, just that one bit of housekeeping. If we would all, any questions anybody might have of Tom, like during his presentation, you can just hit that chat button, enter them into the chat page, and I have an opportunity to then read them at the end of his presentation. I'm sorry, anybody. This is during Brian's presentation. In just a moment here, Tom is going to introduce Brian Sheehy and his presentation. So, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome Brian.
Okay. Brian Sheehy is an award-winning history teacher at North Andover, Massachusetts High School. The author of professional development materials on such interdisciplinary topics as how to incorporate sports themes into the teaching of history, and a National History Day lesson plan on baseball, World War I, and patriotism. Brian also wrote a chapter for the book Stories of Sport, Critical Literacy in Media Production, Consumption, and Dissemination, entitled Selling Patriotism on and Off the Field, Media Connections Between Baseball, the Military, and the Government. He'll be talking with us today about the role of early club road trips, in this case between Brooklyn and Boston, in spreading baseball. This is another key part of the story of how baseball realized its national ambitions that has flown largely under the historical radar. So welcome, Brian, and take it away.
Thank you. Happy to be here with all of you today. My wife isn't so happy. It's our 40th birthday, so we're down in Charleston, South Carolina. I have to be off of this in a little while for our carriage tour, but hopefully we'll have a good time and talk a little bit about the influence of Brooklyn and some of the tours on Boston and the development of baseball in Boston. So the goal of the presentation be to examine how Brooklyn and New York teams helped further the development and establishment of the New York style of baseball as a dominant style of baseball in New England. I'll focus on the impact of New York teams coming to Boston on tours in 1862 and 1865, and the Lowell Club Tour of New York in 1865. In doing this in such a short amount of time, I decided to focus on just Lowell. There were other clubs that obviously did tours, Harvard, the Trimountains, but we're just going to focus on the Lowell experience. I also mentioned the importance and impact that New York transplants had on the development of the game in Boston and New York, obviously a lot from Tom's book, but we'll get into that in a few. So obviously a little quick background on the Lowell Baseball Club. I think it's important to kind of have a little bit of background on them. Named after John A. Lowell of the Bowdoin Club of Boston. He basically suggested creating a team, a bunch of young kids, secondary school in Boston, to get together and to start a club. And to kind of honor him and to kind of celebrate the help that he had in kind of helping them to form, they named the club after him. He provided them with equipment, got them started. 1861, they played their only match against the Medford Club and won 17-10. And as we go through the Civil War, they kind of continued as a junior club, playing a couple of games. They really kind of came upon the scene after the Civil War. And as I'm sure all of you know, which we'll get into a little bit later, they became one of probably the three dominant clubs in the mid to late 1860s. So jumping right into the tours. 1862, the Excelsiors of New York arrived in Boston. They were in their prime, and at this time being the first New York club to visit Boston, created much excitement. Now, this is quoted from James DeWolf Lovett's Old Boston Boys and the games they played, which is probably one of the most important books in understanding early baseball in Boston and early sports in general, looking at all the different development of sport. And James DeWolf Lovett is such a central figure to that. I had the pleasure of going through some of his papers at the Mass Historical Society. in preparation of this presentation, I thought that I'd find more on New York, but a lot of the letters that are in the archives are basically just celebrating him, and they're kind of like fan letters, and kind of really kind of centralized how important of a figure he was, and how memorable the games the Lowell baseball nine played against Harvard, and how it really helped form and develop baseball. But again, we're talking more about the connection today with New York. So in the tour, the Excelsiors played two different games. They played the Bowdoin Club, and then they played a mixed nine club. And obviously, the Excelsiors won both of the games, 39-15 and 39-13. Kind of the importance of that is kind of seen in this quote from Old Boston Boys. It was certainly a privilege to have seen Jim Crichton pitch and Joe Leggett catch him. Crichton had a great influence upon my success as a pitcher. I noted him very carefully and found that his speed was not due to mere physical strength, but that this latter was supplemented by a very long arm and a peculiar twist movement, very quick and snappy, so much so that he was accused of underhand throwing, as I was afterwards. And I think that that's an important piece in understanding the development. Baseball really was, in the New York style of baseball, was really centralized in New York. So by these tours coming and kind of showing people who like from New England, from Boston, the style and how to play, I think it was extremely important in developing the game in general. I think that when you're talking about kind of learning, you have to learn through seeing. And, you know, by the Excelsiors coming over and playing, I think it's really, really helped develop James Wolfe Lovett, and again, helped to develop baseball in general. Whoops. One of the other things I want to kind of highlight here is kind of to backtrack and kind of show the influence that New Yorkers had on the development of the game in New England. And you saw, go back a slide, that you saw one of the mixed nine, go back another slide. You saw one of the mixed nine players here playing against the Excelsiors is Saltman. All right. And he played for the Gotham Baseball Club. He was one of the ones who was influential in the first game being played on Boston Common against the Trimountains and a team from Portland, Maine. And really kind of that transplanting of people from New York coming to Boston really, again, helped develop the New York style of baseball. So you kind of have to have those two branches of like the tree of coming from, and like you definitely have the people who came, and you definitely have the influence of actually seeing some of these teams play and kind of learning from them. And like I mentioned earlier, by the mid 1860s, the champion club or one of the champion clubs, like I mentioned, there were three. The Lowell, Harvard, and Trimountains were kind of the top three teams in Boston in the mid 1860s. And you can see here, the Lowell nine is sitting here with the silver ball trophy for the best team in New England. 1865, there is a tour, okay? And you can see here in this slide, I've got these two examples of a trip, and it's kind of the Lowell Club going and kind of experiencing what New York was like. And these are two examples of New York papers, and you have on the left arrow, obviously Lowell is not as good as any of these teams from New York or Brooklyn. The Resolute Club beats them, but I found it kind of funny when I was reading some of these sources where the New Englanders were not at all disheartened, stating that they had come on more for seeing the finer points of the game than winning a match. And I think that again is important in understanding and developing your skills. You kind of come to New York, you're kind of in the epicenter of where competitive baseball has been played for. The New York style of baseball, competitive New York style of baseball has been played for a long period of time. And learning the game, understanding the game, this is an opportunity for them to learn. And I think that really comes out in a lot of these sources. The article on the right, it talks about they weren't that disheartened. They had some handsome uniforms, they were pretty good fielders, they were excellent batsmen, but they just weren't good enough. Great guys. I found that kind of funny. Some zingers on they really weren't that great of baseball players, but they were kind of nice guys and dressed well. Found that kind of interesting. Here's another, again, some more examples from the New York Times. They were first-class material club. They practiced. What did I want to focus on? All who witnessed their play were impressed with the fact that they were gentlemanly and intelligent. That's kind of what they were there to do. They were trying to be ambassadors of the game in New York and really learn. And I think that really plays out in a lot of the descriptions of these games. And his book, I just thought they were cool. When I went to the New York Public Library, just to kind of take a look at them, see it up close. Tough to read the handwriting if you don't know cursive, which my students have no idea about cursive. So the next day they played the Brooklyn Atlantics, and again, they did not find success. They lost 45-17, which, kind of a lopsided score. The left arrow, Boston received the defeat with the best grace. That's kind of nice. They really kind of took the beating well. One of the things I do want to point to is G. Miller here. We're going to come back to him later. He's one of those transplants from New York who came to the Boston area and was really influential in the game. The arrow on the right, Lowell congratulated themselves on their success. This is kind of like the Patriots at the beginning of the football season, moral victory Mondays kind of thing. They're pretty happy that they had just been there and they had done a couple of things well. And, again, they were just learning. And here's another, here's the next day, playing the Resolutes, and another example from the newspaper. Again, just talks about learning the finer points of the game. They were impressed by the grounds. And again, when you start thinking about Boston, they didn't have the same kind of facilities. The Boston Common wasn't big enough to have big stadiums. So again, it's learning how successful these big stadiums can be. And these are things that are going to influence the professional game later on. And if you start looking, that these are kind of laying the groundworks for what baseball will be later, and how successful it will be in Boston later. And one of the other things that I found kind of interesting, and I know Corky's on, he was on here earlier, they start talking about the baseballs that they used and how impressed they were by the baseballs that they were using in New York, and these Harvey Rose balls that are mentioned, and they had to buy a dozen of them for the use in their games. So again, you can see the influence that these tours are having. They're kind of planting seeds. They're showing the Boston boys how to play, what's the better style of equipment to use, all of that. So really influential in the development of the game. So coming back to Garrett Smith Miller, Garrett was from New York, came to Boston to go to school, and a lot of players who played for Harvard, the Lowells, all went to a lot of the, come back to Tom's book in a second, a lot of the secondary schools, Phillips Academy Andover, which is down the street from where I live, Phillips Exeter, which is up in New Hampshire, were all these very prestigious secondary schools that were kind of training grounds for Harvard. And a lot of New Yorkers, a lot of people from the East Coast came to these schools. And when they came to these schools, they brought baseball with them. And again, kind of that diffusion of introducing the New York style of game of baseball to younger people in the area kind of just helps develop the game of baseball. And Garrett Smith Miller, kind of a side note, also the Oneida Football Club of Boston. There's a memorial or a monument in Boston Common for them. The first football game that was played. James DeWolf Lovett was also on the team. So there's a lot of like that sporting genesis that occurred in the 1860s. Again, has a lot of influence from New York. But going back to Tom's book, there's a whole bunch of pages, 274 to 279, all about this and kind of the influence of New Yorkers on kind of coming to the Boston area and kind of how they were influential in developing the game. So at these secondary schools. So on to the next slide. So Lowell's have done well, though strangely unfortunate in their Resolutes game, and do not at all feel ashamed of the last two games, making 17 runs off the champions and 31s off the Excelsiors. And again, it's they're not winning, they're not finding much success in that realm, but they're learning. They're getting the experience that they need. You know, it's kind of like a minor league team coming in and kind of taking a whooping from some of the better clubs. One of the biggest things that happened, though, is they met Mortimer Rogers. And this trip was memorable in that it brought us in contact with the late Mortimer Rogers, who met us upon the arrival at the station and instantly won the esteem and friendship and regard of all of us. And he would go on and he would play for the Lowell Baseball Club when he moved to Boston. And again, just making those relationships, building those contacts are really important in kind of developing the game. And it did have an influence on the Lowell club in gating a player. And Rogers is going to be really important in developing the New York baseball, or the New England baseballist, really important in kind of developing the game in general in the late 1860s. So then on to Boston. The Atlantic Baseball Club came to Boston September 25th, 1865. And again, you could see by these scores, it wasn't really that close. Lowell didn't find a lot of success. But look at these numbers. When you look at these numbers and you start thinking about developing a buzz, and when you're trying to grow a sport, when you're able to develop a buzz, bringing the Atlantic Club to Boston, you had 5,000 people go to this game. And again, when people start seeing the Atlantic Club play, you can see how that would again help in the development of baseball in New England. Again, Lowell didn't win, but it kind of furthered that cause of developing baseball in Boston. Again, they played the Trimountains the next day. Typically, on these tours, you would play a couple of teams. And again, like I've mentioned a couple of times, the Trimountains, Harvards, and Lowells were who you would play if you came to Boston. These dots and everything are so fascinating to me. And you can see the runs and all that. It's just really funny to see. Had to throw this in, being from the Boston area, finally, and this didn't happen until a couple years later, 1867, Boston won. the arrival of the Excelsiors. The Excelsiors came from Brooklyn. They played the Lowells on the Common, and Lowell won 28-21. So finally, they kind of come full circle, and they had finally beaten a team from New York, and that was no small feat. And kind of just developing the legitimacy of New England baseball. So in a short amount of time, they were able to beat the top dogs. Now, I'm not going to talk about how they didn't really have their best team and how it was a friendly game, but you just got to focus on Boston winning. And Lowell won the first day, and then the Excelsiors lost the second day as well. So that kind of wraps it all up. I happy to take any questions that you guys might have.